It was one of the greatest television cliffhangers of my lifetime. Who shot J.R. was one of the most popular phrases in America in 1980. The season finale, Season 3 of Dallas, aired on March 21st of that year. J.R. Ewing was part of this oil tycoon family, and he was the one who would do pretty much anything to make a dollar. Along the way, he made a lot of enemies. So in that season finale, someone entered his office and shot J.R. But because he had made so many enemies, nobody really knew who it was. Everybody had an idea, but nobody knew who it was. In fact, it was 8 months later, episode 4 of season 4, before we found out who shot J.R. An estimated 83 million Americans tuned in just to find out the answer to that big question. Apparently last week, I made our own little cliffhanger in our series going through Jonah. We were in Jonah chapter 4, just didn't make it all the way through. That was my goal initially, but we didn't make it. So there were some things that were left unanswered, kind of our own little, if you will, cliffhangers. So I heard from a number of you this week, and we will do our very best to finish that study tonight. We're in the book of Jonah. We will finish chapter 4, which also concludes our series. I know we've been here, but we need to go here again. We need to have an understanding of the story to help us appreciate the context of Jonah chapter 4. The story begins in chapter 1 with the word of the Lord coming to Jonah. He's a prophet. And God wanted Jonah to go to Nineveh and preach against them because what they had done was displeasing to him. Rather than obeying the Lord, Jonah ran away from God. He got on a ship headed toward Tarshish, and God sent a huge storm that got everybody's attention, apparently, but Jonah. The only way that that storm could be calmed was for Jonah to be thrown overboard. And when the sailors did that, the storm calmed. We get this idea that the sailors worshiped, they offered sacrifices to God. Jonah, meanwhile, was swallowed by a huge fish. He spent 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of that fish. I guess you could consider that the perfect environment to pray to the Lord. And that's what Jonah did. He ran back to the Lord in Jonah chapter 2. He declared that he would do what the Lord said to do. It has this great overtone of repentance and a desire to obey the Lord. Then at the end of chapter 2, the huge fish vomited Jonah back up onto dry land. Jonah chapter 3 begins much the same way that chapter 1 did, with a commission to Jonah to go and to preach against the Ninevites. This time, rather than running away from God, Jonah ran with God. He went to Nineveh with this message. He said, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Apparently this was a surprise to Jonah, but the people actually responded to his message. Jonah chapter 3, beginning in verse 8, this is the second half of verse 8. Let everyone call urgently on God was the message from the king. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may relent and with compassion turn from His fierce anger so that we will not perish. Jonah chapter 3 does not really talk about him hearing their prayer. What it does notice is that God observed their actions. And their actions were such that verse 10 tells us that God changed His mind and did not carry out the destruction that He had threatened. Again, it apparently surprised Jonah that the people listened, but then when God relented, when God changed His mind, if you will, that's the New Living Translation, that sets us up for chapter 4, where here Jonah, he's run away from God, he's run back to God, he's run with God. This time he runs against God. There's some very some very upfront discussion between Jonah and the Lord, where the Lord questions Jonah, but Jonah gives some very honest answers. And we see what happened as we look in that chapter. Beginning in verse 1, Scripture tells us, "But to Jonah this seemed very wrong, and he became angry." Important statement. We need to remember all of these verses are important in chapter 4, but this is the one that sets the stage. It seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home?" That's why I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. "I knew that you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." But the Lord replied, "Is it right for you to be angry?" Jonah preached and the people repented. Sounds like a great day. And it may have been for everybody except for Jonah. The people heard the word of the Lord and they responded to that. They responded by giving up their evil ways. Maybe the Lord would relent and not bring along this calamity that He's told. So they responded, but Jonah seemed very wrong to him. That's what the Scripture says. It seemed very wrong to him. So Jonah was angry about it. Jonah was angry that God had relented, that he, as the New Living Translation said, that he changed his mind and did not bring along the destruction that he had promised. But what about the Lord? What about the Lord? God had an interesting way of addressing Jonah throughout this chapter. It's some of the most familiar ways that we see God deal with people. And the first one was to ask a question. He asked the question, is it right for you to be angry? Is it right for you to be angry? The Young's literal translation puts it this way: "Is doing good displeasing to thee?" The fact that God had done what was right, that He had done what was good, that it was God's decision to make, was it displeasing to Jonah? Do you have any right to be angry? And Jonah said, "Well, yes, I do." If you'll remember, a couple of things that we wanted to do is last week we asked when Jonah became angry, and then we asked why he became angry. I want us to swap the way that we look at that tonight, the order of that, because it's the when that will get us into the remainder of the chapter. Why did Jonah become angry? A couple of things that we talked about last week is that Jonah might have lost face with the Israelites. Here he is. He's gone to preach to the enemy. He's gone to preach to the enemy. 40 days to change your heart, change your mind, change your ways, or else you're done. Well, then the people changed, and what Jonah had said was going to happen didn't happen. So in Jonah's mind, could it be that, well, now how am I going to go back to the Israelites and preach to them? They're not going to believe what I have to say. Had he lost faith? A second thing we looked at is that the fact that God relented from bringing about that destruction to Nineveh. In some form or fashion, is that an indication that God was losing patience with His people of Israel? That now He was acting with compassion toward the enemy. Is that why Jonah became angry? I still like the idea that this was a good preacher story. That here Jonah, he had gone, he had preached to the Ninevites a strong sermon. 40 more days and you're gone, man. 40 more days and you're going to be overthrown. 40 more days and the destruction's headed your way. And if that had happened, then when he went back to the Israelites, he's preaching to them and he says, you need to repent or perish. By the way, I went and I preached to the Ninevites and that's what I told them. And you see what happened to him? It's time for you to get your act together. It'd make a great preacher story. That's not the way it happened, though. I still maintain, and as I've talked to a number of people, it's interesting. This was the lesson that has probably brought about as much discussion as any sermon I preached in a long time. A lot of us still tend to agree that Jonah was prejudiced against the Ninevites. It was like he was going to get this charge. He was going to find pleasure in seeing the Ninevites suffer in seeing them be overthrown and seeing the destruction headed their way? Could it be that he disliked that group of people that much that he didn't want to see them? Wow. And I think one of the things that troubles me today, we don't have time to do this tonight, and it'll take another lesson, it'll take a lot of study and a lot of prayer on my part, but I would really like to go and to look at Jonah's prejudice against the Ninevites, and to look at today and to see, do Christians have that kind of prejudice against other people? Because I think there are some troubling examples. I'm going to leave that to you to study. I'll study, and maybe at a future day we'll be able to come back and study that more in depth. Now, those are some of the reasons why. The truth is, there's some scripture to back up a lot of what we've talked about, particularly the prejudice. I want to focus now on the when. When did Jonah become angry? The big question becomes, when did Jonah know that God was going to relent from that destruction? When did Jonah become aware that God was going to change his mind? And the reason that we wonder that, did he have to wait the full 40 days? Or as a prophet? As a prophet, did he know what was going to happen at that time? And here's the reason that we ask that. Because Amos chapter 3 verse 7 says, surely the sovereign Lord does nothing without revealing His plan to His servants the prophets. So did Jonah get a heads up? Did he see this coming? Some people would say yes. But then there's some of us that kind of wonder, because there are some things that just leave us kind of trouble. Mainly verse 5 of Jonah chapter 4. Jonah had gone out. He sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter. He sat in its shade and he waited to see what would happen to the city. He waited to see what would happen to the city. Could it be that Jonah went out and he sat up here and he watched just in case God changed His mind? That maybe at the end of the 40 days, I know that God had said He was going to destroy it, then He changed His mind, but maybe at the end of the 40 days He's going to change His mind back and He was going to do what He'd said first of all that He was going to do? We just don't know. But so here Jonah is, and this is where we find him. We find him at this place east of the city. He set up a shelter, but we get the idea that pretty hot sun that's blazing down on that area. God addresses Jonah. God is trying to teach Jonah. He's trying to instruct him, and He does so with a couple of important teaching tools. We see Jesus use these as well in the New Testament, by the way. Questions. One of the greatest ways that we can teach others. If it's a parent teaching a child, if we're teaching the gospel, sharing the gospel with someone, asking questions still is a great teaching method. If we can get that person to give the right answer themselves, for it to come out of their mouth rather than us, there's going to be a good idea that they will remember it and be more convicted about it. So asking questions is always a good plan. But then we also see Jesus give examples. Those are the parables, illustrations, allegories, different things like that He uses in the Gospels. That's what God does here in Jonah chapter 4. We turn to Jonah chapter 4, verse 6. Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head and to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. So we see a lot of God provided. Verse 8, he wanted to die. He said, it'd be better for me to die than to live. We've heard that before too. We see these things coming back again. So there's this teaching tool. Here's the thing that we need to recognize. God provided. Remember that. God provided. God provided the plant. In fact, in James Kaufman, as he looks at this series, he says that you can see clearly the action of God as He provides the plant, as He provides the worm, and then He provides the scorching east wind. This is all the actions and the movement of God to teach Jonah this lesson. Important for us to see there. In fact, I like this. Kaufman says, if there was ever an example of a man being exceedingly glad for all the wrong reasons, here it is. I think that's an important point for us to see. Jonah had gotten angry because the Ninevites repented and that God relented. But then there was this plant, and Jonah's exceedingly glad about that. Kaufman goes on to say that, make sure I read this correctly from my notes. He goes on to say that we at times seem to be more thankful. We seem to be more thankful for sporting events, for vacations, for air conditioning, things like that, than we are for the right to worship God without fear or molestation. So here's some ideas, some things that I think about. The Super Bowl. There were over 100 million people that watched the Super Bowl last Sunday. Over 100 million. And we were working hard to get 100 people, not 100 million, 100 people in our building for worship. Who Shot JR? 83 million Americans tuned in 1980 to watch that conclusion to that cliffhanger. And in all fairness, we'd love for a couple of dozen people to get excited about Vacation Bible School. It's a great opportunity for us to reach this community. It's something that we're looking at reviving. We haven't had Vacation Bible School since 2019. We think this is the year, and we look forward to doing that. But it takes people. But man, we can get excited about the Super Bowl. We can get excited about a television show. But when it comes to worship, when it comes to getting involved in the work of the church, not always the same response. Could it be that we get exceedingly happy about all the wrong things at times? Jonah was angry that God had relented. He was very happy that God provided a leafy plant. And then he was angry that God took the plant away. He was so angry that we again hear him make this statement that he would rather die than live. And so God asked him again, do you have this right? Do you have this right to be angry? Look in verse 9. Is it right for you to be angry about the plant? Here's Jonah's answer now. Remember, we have some pretty honest discussion. Jonah the prophet, whether he's right or wrong, he is honest with the Lord about how he feels. We know where he is on that, right? God said to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about the plant? It is, he said. I'm so angry, I wish I were dead. But the Lord said, God is trying. He is slow to anger. He's abounding in love. He is gracious. He's compassionate. And he is extending this to Jonah right now. He said, you've been concerned about this plant. Though you did not tend it or make it grow, it sprang up overnight and it died overnight. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from the left, and also so many animals? That's Jonah chapter 4, verses 9 through 11. I think we've heard this question before. Is it right for you to be angry? Jonah answered, well, of course it is. Of course it's right for me to be angry. W.J. Dean puts it this way. He says, Jonah's unreasonableness at this point, that it stands fully unmasked. So here it is, at least at this point, as we're hearing this dialogue. Now, as we go back and as we read this, we're reading that and we're going, man, Jonah, that is just so unreasonable. Man, are you listening to yourself? Do you hear the words coming out of your mouth? Fully unmasked. The question is this: did Jonah hear himself? That's part of the problem of the things that we just don't know. We don't know whether he was listening or not. Man, I keep thinking, this verse, this is where God is trying. He's used this example of the plant, and he's talking about the way that he's treated the Ninevites, of how he's responded to their change of heart and their change of action. He's used this example with Jonah, and he says, should I not have concern for the great people of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also the many animals? God's trying to be reasonable with Jonah, to let him know, you didn't do anything to get that plant. It was a gift to you. It's an act of compassion. It was an act of grace. You didn't do anything to deserve that. It was given, it was taken away. It was given, you were exceedingly happy about it, but it was taken away, then you become angry about it. What right did you have to be angry about that? But yet here we are, we're talking about 120,000 people. And Jonah, you're not getting it. Wow. So here's some cliffhanger questions that we have. I wish that Jonah chapter 4 verse 11 was not the end of the story. Because we're left with so many questions. What happened? What happened with your anger? Did you deal with your anger? Were you listening to what the Lord said? Because we've seen this. We've seen you run away from the Lord. We've seen you run back to the Lord. We've seen you run with the Lord. Now we're seeing you run against the Lord. Jonah, what was the next step? Did you come back to the Lord? How did you deal with your anger? You see, there's good lessons for us in that. As we look at our sin, those things that put us in conflict with the Lord. Because I'm firmly convinced there are times when we are running away from the Lord. There are times we're running back to the Lord. There are times we're running with the Lord. At times we're running against the Lord. What's our next step? What's our next step? We're left to wonder about Jonah. Jonah, did you have a change of heart? Not just about you, not just about this anger issue. Jonah, did you have a change of heart about the Ninevites? That now you've seen how important that was to God? Jonah, did you have a change of heart about that? And then there's this idea of, I think this is a great question to ask. Jonah's a prophet of God. He went and proclaimed the word of the Lord. We see evidence of that as we look back in the book of Kings. And we see where Jonah was a prophet proclaiming the word of the Lord. So I'm wondering now, after this experience with the Ninevites, after Jonah chapter 4 verse 11, Jonah, did you preach again? Was this the point where Jonah said, I've had enough. I'm gone. That's it. I'm out. And I know some of you right now go, no, Jonah went back. Well, I've just presented 3 cliffhangers for which there's no answer. Scripture doesn't tell us. I know we can have our hopes. We can have what we sure hope would happen, that we'd like to see Jonah deal with his anger. We'd like to see him have a change of heart toward the Ninevites. We'd like to see him get back on track and be this prophet for the Lord that he was called to be. But we don't know. And there's part of me that just wishes we had just a few more details at the end of the story. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is not for us to finish his story. Maybe the point is for us to finish our story. That as we look, and we've seen, again, we've just talked about this, times that we run away from God, that God commands us to do this, and we do just the opposite. But then we see these times of repentance, of when we come back to the Lord, we seek His forgiveness, and that's a change of heart, a change of mind, leads to a change of action, and now we're running with the Lord. And there are times that we look at what Scripture says, and we're like, oh, that we find ourselves against God. The question is going to be, how do we respond? And the question is going to be, what is our next step? In moments like this when we're in contrary to the will of God, how are we going to respond? So maybe the greatest lesson for us as we leave, because again, wish that there was a more clear ending for us. But maybe the challenge for us is that as we read through, and yes, there's the ship and the storm and the whale and the country with 120,000 people, but as we read through that story, can we find the attitude of Jonah? And can we make application of that in our lives? Because our desire as we leave this study is that wherever we may have been, whether we were running against God, whether we were running back to God, whether we were running away from God, our goal as we leave here is that we want to run with the Lord.